Hello and welcome to Avia Dev Insight Africa, the podcast offering a window to the world of African aviation with your host, Jon Howell, CEO and founder of Avia Dev Africa. Today, I am delighted to say that I am back with the SITA team, although it is slightly different voices to those we've heard on the podcast previously. The aim of today's episode is to understand the latest developments in the field of communications and technology and how through targeted smart investment, African airports and African airlines can make an almost instant and tangible difference to operational efficiency whilst also building resilience and ultimately improving their bottom line. Now, for those of you who don't know, SITA is the world's leading specialist in air transport communications and information technology. They've been supporting and working with the African market for over 70 years. And it has been said many times on the podcast that African airlines and airports and the general ecosystem itself has very specific challenges, as it does in other parts of the world. And so today we're going to focus on these with not just one, but actually we have two guests for you today. Firstly, we welcome Yann Cabaret, who is the CEO of SITA for Aircraft, a business unit of SITA that focuses on the end-to-end aircraft communication management and optimization solutions for airlines, OEMs, and air traffic control. Yann's got over 20 years of experience in both the aviation and telecoms industry. So welcome, Yann.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
And alongside Yann is Martin Smillie, who is the Senior Vice President at the Communications Service Business Unit at SITA. So Martin is responsible for delivering the next generation of communication solutions, and it's those that we're going to dive into first of all. He's got over 25 years of experience in senior roles in the IT and telecoms industry, having worked both in-house and also as a consultant for a variety of multinational organizations. Martin, welcome to you too.
Great to be with you, Jon.
Fantastic. And I want to start with you, actually, just to get a bit of an idea. I always like to start the podcast with where are we now? So can you help us to get to grips with the communications landscape within the African market as we find it today? What are the major challenges, frustrations from the customers on the African continent? And I know it's obviously vast and they are myriad, but when it comes to both maintaining and improving their operations, what is it you're hearing from the customers?
Yeah. So I think, Jon, first thing to say is that we're generally and globally, we're in a really exciting time from the communications perspective. A lot of challenges, but a lot of answers to those challenges that, that are being developed these days from a kind of technology perspective, if you like. And I think if you look at things more broadly, more globally, airports, as we know in particular, are now critical national infrastructure. Just about any part of the world, and Africa is obviously no different. In the African context, airports are also major drivers of economic growth. That I think will continue to be the case in the years to come, probably even more so, I would say. I think in that context, communications become even more vital, more important. What we see today from the customers that we serve, both in Africa and in other parts of the world, is really the need for continuity. We see at airports, for instance, that the complexity of the platforms, the applications, et cetera, they run, and they need to continue to run to be successful on a 24/7 basis, means that we used to be able to put up with maybe a little delay, a little kind of break here and there. We can't do that these days. And when you look at the landscape that we've got in Africa, but there are particular challenges there. And the way that we think about it is purely from a resiliency perspective. How can we bring the latest communications technologies to airports in Africa, to airlines in Africa, essentially to help them be more resilient and, as I said before, keep those operations running 24/7 without a break? And that's where we're at overall from a thinking perspective right now.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. It's really about it just working and the operation having no downtime. There's no tolerance for that. So, yeah, you're with SITA for Aircraft. So your customers, of course, are the airlines themselves. Martin's talked about that seamless connectivity. And is it the same for you with the customers that you talk to? And are they having the same sort of challenges that actually it can be a bit patchy in different areas that they're operating into? Because obviously it's a moving asset. They're working within different bounds depending on what part of the continent they're in.
Sure. And I think the aircraft side is obviously having the same challenges that Martin was mentioning here. And the fact that if you want to go into efficiency, into optimizing the efficiency, obviously the communications link is an essential part, right? And you need to be able to communicate on the ground and you need to be able to communicate while in the air. And the slight difference versus what Martin was saying is that on the aircraft side, you have two types of communications. You have the safety, pilot controller communications, and you have the non-safety, which is the, let's say, the operational data between the pilot and the dispatchers and the controllers of the airline, where basically the operational efficiency comes in. And obviously maintaining a link for both safety and non-safety is critical. And I think what is same and different from what Martin was saying on the ground is obviously in the air. Well, Africa is just immense from a geographic perspective. There's not one Africa, there's multiple Africas, from deserts to jungles to mountains, right? So the ability to deploy communications, to follow en route aircraft is obviously quite a challenge, right? And obviously, because Africa is so immense, you get to the point of fairly low dense area, which pose a bit of a challenge in terms of investment and the return on investment on deploying infrastructure in low density areas. And obviously that's because the consequence then is potential connectivity gaps. And that's obviously where SITA, as you were reminding in the introduction, we've been here serving the industry for 6 years now. And so that's where we serve the industry. So we will make investment decisions to serve the aviation industry, the airlines, and make sure we have coverage where the traffic is, even if arguably in some cases that traffic remains relatively low, but you still need to have that connectivity to ensure safety and operational efficiency.
Yeah, and it's using these and understanding these new technologies that are coming through that obviously when it comes to SITA's perspective from an airline perspective, there's a lot of technology on the aircraft itself now. And then we've got things, satellite technology, cloud-based technology, all of these things are working in harmony and you're kind of putting them all together. Is that kind of how you see your role?
It is exactly. Now we need to take a very practical view, which is today what we need to ensure is that there is network and connectivity for the technology that is currently on board aircraft. And that is why now we're still investing into our VHF network, because that is what equips every aircraft today. And definitely the view is that going forward, we will be providing connectivity and supporting seamless connectivity by relying on additional layers of connectivity that comes from more, let's say, more modern technologies. LEO satellite constellation is the one that comes to mind, right? Whichever it is, right? And that's where actually Martin and I have the same opportunity space, which is new technology, new constellation that are going to open up the range of the possible.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll come to some of the new technologies, but to come back to you, Martin, you mentioned this as the biggest challenge, the biggest issue that is affecting is obviously resiliency and consistency and continued operations. And of course, there are repercussions when communications or IT doesn't stack up and doesn't actually survive those situations. And of course, the unfortunate consequence is disruption to services for passengers, for the airlines, the knock-on effects in terms of scheduling, but also the impact to reputation even for the airlines, for the airports themselves. So how does SITA mitigate this? What solutions have you got that are there to kind of back up this? Because people sometimes are quite nervous to put everything into technology and say, hey, everything's working over here. What if? So how do you allay their fears when it comes to this?
Yeah, look, it's a good question. And the way that I think about networking and technology in general, particularly when it comes to airports and airlines in Africa and in other parts of the world, is that the services that we provide are generally are hidden to some extent. Right? You only know they're there when they don't work. And that's when everything goes wrong. So all of the kind of fancy platforms you've got on top of it, et cetera, they all stop working when the underlying communications network stops working. As I said in my kind of opening comments, where the way we think about that is to make sure that, for argument's sake, if we've got an airport and it doesn't matter where it is, let's say it's in a part of Africa that is relatively well served by infrastructure. Okay, somebody digs up a kind of fiber cable just by mistake around the airport, and then you lose everything. Okay, and we've had situations recently where we thought we were redundant. We had two cables, but somebody managed to dig up two cables at the same time. And everything went blank. And so to Jann's point about kind of some of the emerging technologies that we're seeing now, and remembering that we've been thinking about this question for over 75 years. This is why SITA was formed back in 1949. And so this has been a constant question we try to answer across those decades. And now we're looking at making sure that there are multiple services serving the airport. So that, again, if, for argument's sake, somebody does dig up a cable, if we lose internet connectivity in a place and it's running across a terrestrial circuit, then we can use other technologies. So we can use, for instance, mobile technologies, parts of Africa that are well served from, for instance, a 4G perspective. And then again, as Yann said, LEO constellations are giving us now the ability to provide really good quality connectivity, very, very robust forms of connectivity, if you like, at airports and to airlines. And we can default almost seamlessly now to that type of technology when, for instance, we lose a cable, when we lose terrestrial connectivity. We can default to 4G, 5Gs in some places. We can default now to LEOs. And that's something that, again, we're taking advantage of by providing those multiple services to the same place to, again, as I said at the start, just ensure that resiliency factor is as high as it physically can be.
Yeah, amazing. So it's multiple layers that actually you wouldn't even know. It's a bit like when I'm in the house and I'm on Wi-Fi, I walk outside, my Wi-Fi drops off, I'm onto mobile data. I didn't know I'm still listening or watching whatever it was that I was watching. And having multiple layers of this that you can say, if that doesn't work, we've got something underneath that can slip in and nobody would know while we're fixing back up. So there's an optimum solution, but then there's also that resiliency driven by those other solutions as well.
We assume, we assume kind of that things will go wrong. So we're talking to our customers when we're looking at the technology that we deploy, we always assume that something will go wrong. And it's about understanding what could go wrong and making sure that there's a solution for it when it happens. And it does happen, absolutely, just about every day.
Absolutely. So let's come back to you, Yann. Let's talk about a specific topic and a specific product that actually has featured on this podcast before, back 3 years ago, which was OptiFlight, which is all about route optimization. Now, as AviaDev, we're all about route development and network development and connectivity. So this was really interesting, and any solution that can save time, can save money for one of our airlines is really welcome. So it's 3 years on from that initial conversation that we had. So talk to us about what's happened the last sort of 3 years with OptiFlight, how it works, and what some of the results have been.
Sure. It's actually quite an opportunity, that recording, to get back in time and see where we were 3 years ago, right? And indeed, no, fuel has never been as important as it is today, right? And this is valid for any airlines in the world, right? Now, for Africa in particular, I mean, fuel prices are amongst the highest globally in Africa. So the dependency on fuel prices for African airlines is actually massive, right? And so it's actually even more important than in other places or in the world. And the other thing is, it's clear that most of African airlines would be operating, they won't be operating the most fuel efficient aircraft. A few major airlines have been investing into more efficient aircraft, being 787s or A350s, right? So the likes of Ethiopian Airlines or Royal Air Maroc would have invested in there. The truth is, most airlines are not operating today's most efficient aircraft. At the same time, more constraints come in, which is fuel prices, SAF for the one who are going to fly typically in Europe, and which obviously is more expensive than standard fuel, right? So the challenge is actually huge for the aviation industry and even bigger for the African airlines. And yes, OptiFlight has been our bet for the last 3 years, which is really around how do we get aircraft data, every single aircraft data, and we create a digital twin of that aircraft. So we are able to optimize the fuel flow of that aircraft. And to do this, we obviously get data from the flight plan, the weight of the aircraft, and obviously something that is quite key, which is everything related to the weather. So weather data for that particular flight on that particular day. And we will provide recommendations to optimize the climb and then the cruise and then the descent of the aircraft. And in terms of numbers, now you were asking where were you now versus 3 years ago? We have signed 40 airlines on the climb optimization, 40. between that call today, that recording that we do together, and where we were 3 years ago. And that's about 5,000 tails that we have signed for those 40 customers, right? So it's nearly 25% of the flying aircraft that are going to use climb optimization from SITA. And obviously, now we will move into other phases of flight, so cruise, which is we're doing now, and also descent will hit market probably next year.
Wow, amazing. A couple of questions, follow-ups on that.
Yeah.
One, is this only available on the new aircraft, or can it be retrofitted to the existing aircraft so that you can optimize? And secondly, what are we talking about percentage-wise in terms of savings? So not
Sure.
empirical numbers that how much money they're saving, but what percentage can you save through optimizing the ascent?
So the first part of your question is, can that be, there was the name retrofit in there, right? Can that apply to modern aircraft or legacy aircraft? So the beauty of it is that there's nothing on board the aircraft. So it's not something that is line fit or retrofit. Every aircraft, every airline downloads aircraft data for training and safety purposes. And that's the data that we will consume. So every aircraft, we get data after every flight. So after every flight of a given aircraft, we get data and we continue building up that model. So actually the model that we have developed is applicable on any aircraft type. So any 737, 320 generation, we do 380s, 777. So today we actually have quite a large panel of aircraft that we already support. And there's obviously a few more that we could support, but that's really where we are today. And so that means that any type would be supported. In terms of numbers, I think typically on climb, we would save up to 5% of climb out fuel. So to give an order of magnitude, right, that'd be something like 70 kilos of fuel on a single aisle takeoff, or 150 kilos per takeoff on a 350. And for what's coming on cruise, so here we're looking at potentially saving up to 3% of the cruise fuel, which could, in some long-range flights, be like a ton of fuel, right? So we're not talking small numbers. We're really getting close to those numbers that we've heard for a long time, which is by better efficiency, we could save 10% of overall fuel. I'm not saying that's where we are now, but I'm saying it's reasonable to see ourselves going into those sort of numbers.
Yeah, and it's all about the compounding effect and the iterative improvements that can improve that. And then ultimately this helping the airlines hit sustainability targets and also be more profitable because they've got a lower fuel cost. So everybody in the sector. And let me just stay with you for one more question because it's very specific. You talked about this in your first answer, talking about the geography of Africa, and that's weather and that's turbulence. So you've got some solutions around this as well about avoiding turbulence and navigating it and that sort of stuff. How does that work and what's the benefit for the airlines themselves?
So today there is already a multiplicity of suppliers who would provide weather data around the globe. And at SITA, we already aggregate multiple sources of weather data. Now, when we were talking about LEO constellations, I strongly believe that weather predictions and the granularity and the quality of weather prediction is going to be something that is massively evolving over the years to come, because obviously the ability to predict an ever more unpredictable weather becomes very important, being for ground operations or even flight operations, without even talking about drones or electric aviation, right, where actually having accurate weather information is going to be totally critical. So today we aggregate those data, we will integrate new technologies as they come in, and we make them available to everyone, to pilots through their iPads, to dispatchers who are following the flight on our applications that we run in operation centers. And we are also working with ANSP, so the air traffic control, for them to also get access to that high quality weather data, because arguably this is also something that is not up to par, not only in Africa, in any part of the world. Usually the air traffic control and the ANSPs are not the one getting the best weather info. And that is something that we're certainly looking at addressing.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah. So you say it's such an interesting concept because that part of the world, but it speaks to what you've mentioned there at the end, that the fragmentation sometimes when it comes to how things are done in one jurisdiction versus another. And of course, in a flight from Europe to Africa, you can pass through so many different ANSPs and they've all got their own process. So having this additional data is huge.
If I may, I'll say this is not a future project, right? So today we already have customers who are non-African airlines who are overflying, landing in Africa, to whom we are already providing that service. So I'm not here pitching a future product. The ability to provide accurate weather data to pilots, dispatchers, controllers in Africa is already there.
Yeah, fantastic. No, great to know. Martin, before we go, I wanted to come back to you because we've talked about resilience, we've talked about the challenges, we've talked about the fail-safes. But for those airports listening now, like you said, they're critical national infrastructure. Many are owned by governments in Africa themselves as well. So if an airport's identified cybersecurity and improved connectivity from a resilience perspective as a priority, how and where should they get started? Do they start with an audit? Where do they go to get themselves up and running so that they can be future-proofed?
Yeah, John, that's a big question. Let me try and break it down a little, if you like. Obviously, airports in Africa are getting a lot more sophisticated in the platforms they're deploying, the way they deploy those platforms. They've got access to the cloud, and many more of these platforms that are cloudified, if you like, do rely on the internet for access back and forth. Back not too long ago, you saw a lot of platforms that were either at the airport, located in the airport, or were just on private networks. So the need for security was still there, but it was less. And with kind of the bandwidth we got available and required for these platforms, the access to the cloud, etc. So security has become a lot more relevant, if you like, than it has been in the past. In that context, the way that I think about this in really simple terms is in two sort of main ways, if you like. Firstly, what we define as IT hygiene, if you like. IT hygiene, to me, means that you're doing the basics right within your IT environment. For instance, if you've got a patch that needs to be deployed, you're deploying your patch, when you need to and how you need to. If you've got access to complicated systems or complex systems, you're managing that access. You're only giving access to the people that need it. You're not sharing passwords around, all of those good things, because the bad guys, they take advantage of people actually being a little bit lax in the way that they're actually managing their environment. Nothing necessarily to do with security per se, okay? But if you don't manage your environment right from the basics perspective, then you can get exploited fairly easily. So that's the way I think about that first part of the equation. The second part of the equation gets more into the security complex, if you like, and an architecture itself. So have you got the right architecture? Have you got the right layers of protection, okay, both in the airport and if you're an airline customer in your environment at the airport? So that's everything from firewalls to maybe privileged access platforms and more complex security devices, so intrusion protection, et cetera, et cetera. Have you got that architecture there? Have you got it working? Are you managing it? So just to go back to your initial question, how do you get started? You get started by doing the basics right, making sure that your IT hygiene is where it needs to be. Secondly, then you probably want to talk to and make sure you're talking on an ongoing basis to somebody who's absolutely qualified to design an architecture for you, implement that architecture, and in many cases, operate that architecture. Again, airports in Africa are organizations that may not have the IT skills that are required, okay, to manage very complex environments. So the customers are demanding complex environments. Can you manage it? In many cases, and not just in Africa, but in different parts of the world, that's difficult. Okay, so then you might want to look at outsourcing both the implementation and the management of your security platforms to ensure that you can provide your customers with the right level of safety, if you like, from an IT perspective. So that's a relatively simplistic view, if you like, as to how I think about things. Do the basics right, get the experts in who actually know about it, think about outsourcing it, think about holding them to the highest standards and having them deploy the latest protection available.
Yeah, so having an overall understanding of what's required, so you're not just leaving it to somebody else, but it all starts with those fundamentals. I think that's a great message for everybody, is to understand that actually as a national asset, you probably are a bit of a target, right? And therefore keep your basic security at that level, make sure that everybody in the organization is meeting that requirement, and obviously making it as difficult as possible for anybody to implement that, but then having the fail safes and having the expertise in the background. I think that's really good. And we'll put some links to some resources in the show notes as well if you want to take this further with the teams after the call. But before we finish, Yann, just from your side, the airline customers that are listening that want to know a little bit more about the solutions, where can they go? There's a central resource for them to learn a little bit more about some of the solutions, because there's a huge suite, right?
Yeah, I mean, in most cases, the airlines who are listening to us will have a contact with their SITA account manager, because, as we say, we've been around for a good chunk of time. So obviously, the SITA contacts that they have already in the airlines will be able to engage and ultimately go through the entirety of solutions that could be practically implemented. And if you don't have a contact with SITA, I mean, I'm available on LinkedIn. You can always get back to me, and I'll make sure you get the right contact, and we take care of your questions. And so that'd be a pleasure.
Fantastic. What I'll do then, because you've allowed that now, you've opened the door, Yann, I'll put the links in the show notes so you can connect or follow Yann, Martin through that platform, through LinkedIn, which I know all the listeners here are pretty much connected with me on there anyway. And I think it's a huge asset. But thanks for both of you for joining us and for sharing your expertise today, because SITA is a leader in the space, has done so much from an African perspective. And I love doing this on a regular basis. Your colleague from SITA, Adonis Sukar, on our previous podcast, he adopted the term think big, start small, scale fast. And I love that as a general overview as to the way that we can approach technological solutions, both from the airport side and the airline side as well. And therefore, we can have a more resilient, a more profitable, and a more future-focused African aviation industry, and SITA is definitely playing a part. So thanks to both of you for joining us today. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, John.
Thank you, John. Likewise.
Yeah.
Thank you. And thanks to all the listeners out there. If you did enjoy this episode, if there's somebody in your network you think would benefit from listening, hit the share button now, share it in your network. We will be back for the next episode very soon. So take care and thanks for joining us. Bye-bye.